I sometimes walk the city, as you do, and I notice that there is garbage. And on occasion, I remember hearing stories of these people who would just be, I don't know, spelunking or enjoying a beach, and they would find a random suitcase. And part of me always wonders what is going to be inside these things. Is it clothes? Is it money? Or will it be something horrible, like a body? I've heard about a lot of cases where some people are just on a beach enjoying life when all of a sudden they find a suitcase and they open it up and inside is a body. In today's case, the discovery of human remains were found in 6 plastic barrels within a bank vault in the small southern town of Snowtown in May of 1999. The remains were one of the most prolific and psychologically horrible cases in Australian history. This investigation, eventually termed Operation Barcoma, uncovered a decade-long spree of torture, murder, and systemic financial fraud perpetrated by a group of individuals led by John Bunting. This case is notable not only for the number of victims, but for the chilling nature in which the crimes were unveiled. It's horrible because the ringleader, John, he framed all these murders as a vigilante mission to cleanse society of pedophiles and homosexuals. To understand the Snowtown murders is to delve into a truly horrible case of where social safety nets just allowed 12 individuals to disappear without any detection at all. This is the case of John Bunting. Hi, and welcome to the Decomposing Flower podcast. I'm your host, Kira, and with me is Jen. Everything we say in our podcast today is stuff that we have gathered from trustful sources, but keep in mind, we get this off the internet, so some of the things we have might be incorrect. But I do try to gather them from trustful sources like articles and official documents. So keep that in mind as we go on. Today's case is going to be a little bit more of a darker one. As you can tell from the beginning, some of the warnings for this case, trigger warnings, are going to be torture, murder. And if you're just not in a place to listen to something like that, I would suggest checking out one of our other episodes, and we'll catch you in the next episode. The crimes primarily unfolded in the northern suburbs of Adelaide, specifically in Salisbury North during the 1990s. This whole region was characterized at the time as having urban decay, I'm going to describe it as, where there was a lot of unemployment. Things were dirty and a little bit unsafe due to a lack of social safety nets. There was a environment where vulnerable, isolated individuals were easily manipulated and they were able to disappear without anyone noticing. The bodies in the barrels is somewhat misleading, as only one of the murders actually occurred in Snowtown, and the whole case is known as the Snowtown Murders. However, it was merely the final resting place for 8 of the victims because of where these bodies were found, as they were found in an abandoned bank building, which was rented by one of the accomplices in today's case, Mark Hayden. And we will get into all the accomplices and all the victims today. But the perpetrators and their victims were part of a closed social circle, and this led to an internal predation, which is pretty rare as far as serial killers go, as most of them choose to go after complete strangers, but they all knew each other. In the Snowtown case, lovers, friends, relatives, and neighbors were transformed into targets or weapons. Like I said, the environment of this time in Adelaide provided a cloak of invisibility in a community where government reliance and this lifestyle was part of the norm, where some people would suddenly move away or to a different suburb. It was more the drifter lifestyle. Today's case heavily relied on how John Bunting was able to manipulate the people around him. This includes both the victims and the accomplices, as these were people with low levels of formal education. They had cognitive disabilities or histories of severe trauma. This demographic is frequently susceptible to manipulation, as we can see time and time again, especially if we're in a case of having a powerful, charismatic figure who offers a sense of purpose by just following a simple framework. They will be able to have success and have these great lives. It's easy to convince people who don't have a lot that they can do something about it. John didn't offer friendship, he offered a crusade by identifying pedophiles as the source of the community's troubles. He provided a target for the residents' frustrations and a justification for the violence that would follow. One of the first victims, Clinton Tricet, was found in lower light. However, a lot of today's case, there were remote torture sites and temporary burial sites used in order to move victims away from surveillance during their torture. But I'll get into it in a little bit here. The group was led by John Bunting, who had served as the primary manipulator for the other participants. He had this innate ability to coerce others into committing extreme acts of depravity, as he was pretty organized and charismatic. John's personality was interesting, to say the least. He was described as a warm, friendly father figure to some people, and for others, they described him as the master, as he dominated them. John was born on September 4th of 1966, and his early childhood was wrought with trauma. At age 8, he was beaten and sexually assaulted by an older brother of a friend. Later on, it's not far to stretch your imagination, as this would perhaps be a precursor to his later obsession about his hatred of pedophiles. So it could have been that he sought to destroy the very image of what his abuser had done to him. John also exhibited early indicators of the McDonald triad, which includes animal torture. During his childhood, he was known to torture ants with acid, and in late adulthood, he progressed to killing and skinning cats and dogs, often forcing his stepson, James Valcaz, hopefully I pronounced that right, to watch or participate even. Eventually, he would move on to being able to do this to other victims. He, interestingly, lacked a sense of smell starting from birth, which enabled him later on to tolerate the horrific stench of what he had done in this bank vault. A smell so potent, it eventually alerted the public and the authorities despite the vault seal. As a young adult, John worked as an abattoir, where he reportedly bragged about the slaughter of animals, identifying it as an aspect of the job he enjoyed the most. This comfort with gore and destruction of a corpse translated later on in his life. By the time he moved to Salisbury North in 1991, he had begun to cultivate sort of this vigilante persona, as he created a rock spider wall. And that's where you get a chart of names connected by yarn, representing individuals he thought might be pedophiles or homosexuals. This wall wasn't merely a list of targets. It was a tool that he used to implicate his accomplices. By selecting names from the wall and discussing their infractions, John created a shared delusion of righteousness, that what they were doing was right. He convinced his followers that the victims were the disease and that their group was the cure. So his accomplices, John was able to identify individuals who were either as damaged as himself or so malleable that he could make them into his own image. One of his first accomplices was Robert Wagner. He befriended John in 1991 and became his most loyal accomplice. Previously, he was active in neo-Nazi groups. Robert already possessed an extreme worldview that valued dominance and violence. And put two and two together, it was not good. Robert's relationship with John was one of absolute loyalty. He was the primary enforcer and active participant in almost every single murder. Despite the group's stated mission to target homosexuals, Robert himself was reportedly involved in a long-term relationship with Barry Lane, who was a cross-dresser and convicted pedophile who would later become one of the group's victims. So this whole vigilante, oh, we only go after pedophiles, was a pretty thin veneer for the two of them, I would say. During trial, Robert appeared to relish in the details of his crimes, viewing himself as a necessary tool to get rid of all these people. One of the other accomplices in today's case was James Falakis, and again, I hope I'm pronouncing that last name right, who entered John's orbit as a teenager when his mother, Elizabeth Harvey, began a relationship with John. James was a unique figure in the case, to say the least. He was John's stepson, and for people that knew him, they described him as a passive protagonist, someone who was eventually groomed and coerced into the killing operation. John initially acted as a warm, charismatic father figure, something that James had been missing his entire life. However, the relationship soon turned dark as John used animal torture as initiation, forcing James to watch the skinning of animals in order to desensitize himself to the violence that John would later go on to force him to do. James eventually participated in the torture and murder of his own half-brother, Troy Udy, and his stepbrother, David Johnson. His involvement was driven by a combination of fear and a warped sense of familial duty. James eventually cooperated with the Crown and was a pivotal factor in securing the convictions against John and Robert, providing firsthand testimony that forensic evidence alone could not. Mark Hayden was another one of the accomplices in today's case, as he assisted in the disposal of bodies, including that of his own wife, Elizabeth Hayden, and Troy Yodi. So all these people are intermingled with each other. That's James's half-brother Troy. But Mark's role was largely logistical, as he rented the Snowtown Bank building in January of 1999 specifically to store these barrels which contained the victims. While Mark claimed to be less involved in the actual killings, his participation in moving the remains of his own wife and son illustrates just how deep he was involved in this. So Robert participated in 10 of the murders. James participated in 4 of the murders. It's just crazy how manipulated these people were. Finally, Elizabeth as well. She was an accomplice in all this, as she had knowledge of the crimes and assisted in at least one of the murders. So it was very weird how John would go about selecting them, as he imagined infractions. The selection process itself were very fluid, as he had a mantra that they would go after pedophiles and homosexuals. But this eventually moved on to, oh, did they use drugs? Oh, were they obese? Oh, were these people just weak or a risk to our security? As far as I know, those aren't pedophiles. The first victim, Clinton Trias, was 20 when he was murdered in August of 1992. John invited Clinton into his Salisbury home, where he eventually bludgeoned him to death with a shovel. The motive was he had a suspicion of pedophilia based on flimsy evidence. Clinton's body was buried in a shallow grave at Lower Light, where it remained undiscovered for 2 years. This murder was only the beginning of John's operation. as his next victim would come more quickly. His name was Ray Allen Peter Davies, who was only age 26 when he was murdered. He was a intellectually disabled man who lived in a caravan behind the home of John's ex-girlfriend, Suzanne Ellen. In December of 1995, he was targeted after allegations were made that he approached children. James testified that John and Robert drove Ray to a remote residence in Barcata and tortured him in a bathtub, where they bashed his genitals with a pole until he died. John's ex-girlfriend, Suzanne Ellen, who was aged 47, was an associate of John until her remains were found buried in his backyard in May of 1999, wrapped in 11 plastic bags. While John claimed she died of a heart attack, no way. This man murdered her straight. Like, why would you bury her in a backyard? But the prosecution suspects that it was murder, even though it was not founded, that there was a deterioration in their relationship and John just murdered her. Her death marks a critical transition as John began to realize that the disappearance of his own associates could be profitable. He continued to collect her pension, totaling to $17,000 for years after her death. As John's influence over Robert and James solidified, the frequency and brutality of the killings increased. The victims were no longer just suspected pedophiles, but were chosen for potential financial gain or to eliminate witnesses to their crimes. Their next victim, Michael Wagner, who was only 19 when they strangled him with a rope. To cover their crime, John and Robert staged a robbery at his home to convince his partner that he had fled to pay for gender-affirming surgery. Barry Lane, who was 42, was a former lover of Robert Wagner. Like I mentioned, he was a cross-dresser, but he was tortured and killed in 1997. His body was just one of those found in the barrels. Thomas Trevelyan was 18 when he was found hanging from a tree, initially thought to be a suicide, but later it was revealed that he was murdered by the group. Gavin Poiter, who was 29, he was a roommate of James, who was strangled in a car when it was parked on John's driveway. Then finally, there was the betrayal of the family. Troy Yodi, who was 21, was James's half-brother. In September of 1998, he was dragged from his bed, tortured, and strangled in a bathroom while James was forced to participate. This murder was a tool of dominance over James, ensuring that he was too involved ever to go to the police. He was scared out of his mind. If they would do this to his half-brother, what would they do to his mother? To him? So he never went to the police. Elizabeth Hayden, who was the wife of Mark Hayden, was 37 when she was murdered in November of 1998. Her disappearance was one of the primary triggers for the police investigation. Mark Hayden's involvement in the disposal of her body was chilling, to say the least, and it really created this whole cult-like circle. But it all culminated with the final victim, the murder of David Johnson. He was 24 when he was murdered in May 1999 inside Snowtown Bank's building. David was James's stepbrother. This murder was horrific. James and Robert reportedly fried up and ate parts of David after his death. It's just so horrible to think about. But there was a lot of torture. Pretty much all of their victims were tortured. And I won't get into how or who they did it to because the victims don't deserve that. However, the Snowtown Murders involved prolonged torture designed to elicit both information and gratification for the perpetrators. The victims were often bound with electrical cords, duct tape, or handcuffed and just forced to stay alive for days and hours as, their skin would be torn off. The primary instrument of torture was a Valeric metallurgy tool where John used to deliver controlled electric shocks to the victim's genitals and other sensitive areas. This tool was used not only for pleasure, but as a means of interrogation, forcing victims to reveal bank pins and social security details. Other methods they did were crushing toes with pliers, burning ears and noses with cigarettes, and in one case, inserting and lighting a sparkler into a victim's genitals. The method of killing was almost always strangulation, using ropes or jumper cables. To ensure death, John or Robert would jump on the victim's chest to dispel any remaining air from the lungs and probably break their bones in the process. After death, the bodies were crudely dismembered. John's experience in the meat industry was evident here. The dismemberment was functional and fit neatly into these plastic barrels. The barrels were filled with hydrochloric acid. John believed that this would dissolve the remains and eliminate any forensic evidence. However, he estimated the volume of biological fluid that seeps from corpses. This fluid neutralized the acid, and instead of dissolving, the bodies were preserved in an oxygen depleted fluid environment, which led to an extreme state of just decay and the worst smells imaginable. This created a challenge for the forensic team as the DNA was so degraded by the chemical environment in these barrels that profiling was thought to initially be impossible. However, the soft tissues were preserved enough to show evidence of torture. The investigation into the Snowtown murders was one of the longest and most complex in South Australia history. It began as not a search for a serial killer, but as a routine investigation into missing persons and social security fraud. A primary motive for the murders was financial gain. By impersonating victims and forging signatures, the group collected approximately $97,000 in pensions. It was confirmed that they were also collecting welfare payments for individuals who had not been seen for years, which eventually led the police to become involved, where they found surveillance cameras capturing John accessing victims' bank accounts after they disappeared. In early 1999, the group moved the barrels from various storage sites in Adelaide to the Snowtown Bank Vault, where Mark Hayden once again rented it, but he had it under the guise of storing pickled kangaroos in order to explain the smell. On May of 1999, acting on tips and leads, police breached the vaults, where they discovered the barrels containing the remains of 8 people. The trial of John and Robert lasted for 142 days and involved hundreds of witnesses. The core of the prosecution's case was the testimony of James, who gave a detailed account of the playing, which was the group's term for torture, and it was so graphic. It involved extensive suppression orders in order to prevent public trauma. James described a culture where John was treated as God or master. He testified that John and Robert appeared to relish their moments in court, viewing themselves as misunderstood heroes rather than criminals. James' confession was not just a legal turning point, but also a psychological break from John's control. He was sentenced to a minimum of 26 years, reflecting his role as an accomplice and a victim of John's grooming. In 2003, the final sentences were carried out. John, who was convicted of 11 murders, was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Robert, who was convicted of 10 murders, also received a life sentence without parole. Mark Hayden was sentenced to 25 years with an 18-year non-parole period for his role in disposing of the bodies, and he's already free. He was released from prison in May of 2004. James was granted parole as well in 2005. Yeah, so this case is just a horrible tale of how someone snuck into a circle and just absolutely ruined it. John arrived. He was the first person to treat James with respect. He went around fixing things around the house and protecting the boys from creeps next door. But the creep was really inside the whole time. Some of the things I got from the trial: John would gather the neighbors and introduce people to the wall, where he would point at names and show them his whole rock spider wall, where he would say, "The police won't do anything, but we will." And he created a community based on a shared enemy, on these imaginary people, of how he would just say, "Oh, yep, they're pedophiles." John would take James to see the work that he would do. He would talk about the beauty of the anatomy. And later in the backyard, where John would kill stray dogs and make James watch him skin it, he would say, "It's just meat, James. Everything is just meat." The first disappearance, Clinton, John would kill him in the living room. The shock was not just the violence, but the calm after. As John explained to James, who was terrified, that Clinton was a predator and that they've done the world a favor. He then uses Clinton's credit card to buy pizza for the family, turning this horrific night into something mundane. "Oh, yep, there's a dead body in our living room, but here we go. We got our Pizza Hut." The whole part where they first did their first torture on Ray, John wanted to turn into, rather than just a vigilante, into being referred to as Lord, Sir, Master. He was trying to create this larger than life persona for himself as he forced Robert and James to participate in the torture. And he recorded the sessions, telling him, "You're one of us now. There's no going back. We have you on tape." And during the murder of Troy, James was forced to hold his own brother down while John applied the shock torture. And James was emotionally destroyed after this. He was no longer a witness. He was a killer to his own brother. But unfortunately, the trauma in Snowtown isn't over yet. For the community of Snowtown, the stigma remains as being a tourist attraction. This is a town where so many horrific murders happened. Residents have struggled for decades to reclaim their town's identity from the crimes that happened here by people who didn't even originally live here. As the perpetrators are eventually released, or they have been released already, the families of the 12 victims are forced to relive the trauma, proving that the impact of the killers didn't end with just the prison sentence. The Snowtown case stands as a permanent warning that darkness can flourish, especially when you have a predator who wants to take advantage of the isolation and poverty and people around him. And that's where we're going to leave it for today's case. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you take care of yourself. Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below. We always love to hear your thoughts and opinions. Today was a little bit of a heavier case, so like I said, take care of yourself. If you have any case suggestions, leave them down in their Google form, and we'll see you in the next episode. Bye.